Good evening, everyone. If I could draw your attention to the front. First of all, if anyone gets claustrophobic, we have it's set up where there is a TV screen set up with a live wire, live feed upstairs with plenty of room. So if you want to go upstairs, you're free to do that. I'll ask everybody who's on the ends, please be very careful about the paintings on the walls. Again, we are in the midst of the world's largest collection of John Vanderlyn portraits, and if you break one, you bought it. So I don't know how much it is, so please be aware of your surroundings. Again, my name is Paul O'Neill. On behalf of Kingston's Buried Treasures, I'd like to welcome you to our 15th presentation of our lecture series. We made it 15 presentations. When we started this, we thought we might make a couple, and maybe 15, 20 people would show up. So it's been great, and we thank all of you for your interest in the extraordinary history of Kingston. Tonight's presentation is Rondout The Boom Years, and we are very, very fortunate tonight to have Bob Steuding, who is the author of a book that I'm sure probably almost everybody here has read. If not, you need to read it. It's called Rondout, a Hudson River Port, and it is an absolutely wonderful book. It is really the go-to book for Rondout. So we are very fortunate to have Bob here, because not only is he a wonderful historian and author, he's probably one of the nicest guys you're ever going to meet. So Bob, again, we thank you and we welcome you here. Bob Steuding.
Thank you, Paul. No one's ever called me that before, so. And can you hear me? I don't have to. You can't hear me? Okay. How about that? Still? We all must be of a certain age. I know that. I know about that. It's a pleasure and an honor, of course, to be invited to speak here. I feel particularly happy to do that, and particularly at home, really, here, because a substantial portion of my book, Rondout, that Paul so graciously mentioned to you, was written here. I kind of have it in my right up above here where the old archives were. Some of you probably remember them. I'm not sure if they're still there now, but those were the good old days when there were card catalogs, you know, those when you'd pull those wonderful cards out, and if the electricity went off, it didn't matter, and you know, that kind of thing. There was no air conditioning, I remember, and I was teaching at Ulster County Community College at that time, so much of the work was done during the summer. And it was very hot up there, I remember, very, very hot. And I was always afraid that the sweat that was coming off my brow would spoil the manuscripts. So I'd be there to catch it or something, but very much at home. And to give a talk in a room that's graced by all these wonderful Vanderlyn paintings is a dream come true. Also, it's a distinct honor to have so many distinguished people in the audience. I'm not going to start naming them other than Ed Ford, who was the dean, because it would, you know, take too much time. But thank you for coming, and you grace the affair as much, if not more, as the Vanderlyn paintings. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm not going to show lantern slides. That's someone said at a talk some while ago, because I don't use the new computer things. Can't remember what it's called. But I still use the old-fashioned slides, you know, so you'll hear the projector and I'll have to get up and switch it and so on. But at least I have gone beyond when you had a candle, you know, and you held that up. And, you know. But I mean, that in Vanderlyn's time, that was quite popular, as a matter of fact, so he would be comfortable too. But I'll show you a number of images of early Rondout, but as Paul said, primarily Rondout in its boom years, in the years of Thomas Cornell and Samuel Decker Kirkendall and so on, and the Cornell Steamboat Company and Mary Powell and so on. So I think you'll enjoy seeing those. And I think what I'll try to do in the in the few minutes that I've been allotted is to give you some sense of who shaped Rondout, who were the people that made Rondout. Now, of course, I'm going to leave out 99% of everybody, but at least choose some of the more prominent individuals, and I've mentioned two already, and give you some idea of what happened in Rondout, because a great deal happened in Rondout. There was a wonderful controversy, really, competition, I guess is a better word, between uptown here and downtown Rondout. And it's not over yet, so, well, we still don't know yet who's won. Samuel Decker Kirkendall, who controlled Rondout in its last great years, said one time, somewhat irascibly, when someone asked him about the competition, he said, "Don't worry," he said, "you'll see grass growing on Wall Street." And who knows? Maybe that, there's still time. That can possibly happen. So some sense of that. So who shaped Rondout and some of what's what's in the past, what happened there. I guess that's okay. Maybe we don't need lights out. Can you see that image? Is it bright enough? Is it? That's the half moon, as you know. The first people really to record anything, to tell us anything about Rondout, who were from Europe, came up the river in 1609, right? A long time ago. And they had passed Manhattan Island, and as is the case really with Europeans at those times, they killed a few Indians and did a little training and things of that sort, and then continued up the river. They were looking for the East Indies. Hudson, who was the leader of the expedition, there were only 18 men. It's hard to imagine how few there were in such a small ship. But you may remember the replica that came to Kingston some years ago, and you wondered how 5 people could fit in the ship. But they came up the river in September of 1609. Looking for a way to get to China, really, to the west, to the east, Northwest Passage. And it was a misty morning. It's interesting how it occurred. And all of a sudden, as often happens in September, sort of like a beautiful day like today in October, the mist cleared, and they looked to the west, and there were the mountains, the Catskill Mountains. And the description of them is quite touching. See these wonderful mountains to the west and so on. And then they saw there were people that were along the shore that came out to them. Indians, right? American Indians. And they came out to the ship, and even though they had fought with the Indians at the entrance to the Hudson River, they seemed to sense that these Indians were not angry or not violent or ever. And as a matter of fact, in the meeting between the native peoples and these Europeans, mainly Dutch, although Hudson was English, Robert Jewett, who was the chronicler of the expedition, said they were very, it's interesting, the phraseology, he said, they were very loving people, and there were many old people among them. And I thought, hey, that's great, right? And where they saw them, where the mist cleared, was somewhere, can't tell exactly, but somewhere between where the Esopus comes out in Saugerties and where the Rondout comes out in Kingston. Maybe it was Malden or someplace along there. But that was our area. They said, what wonderful people live here, and they live a long time. This might be a good retirement community, something of that sense. Then they went up the river to Albany and to Cohoes. They were stopped by the falls. They realized this was not the way. So they turned around, and about almost 2 weeks later, a little bit less than that, they passed the Rondout, but said nothing about it, fought with a few more Indians, and then entered the Atlantic Ocean and went back to Holland. And it's interesting, I never followed it up until I worked on the book, but it turns out that Hudson himself made 4 journeys to the New World. We're only concerned with this one in particular, where they were looking for this particular passage. And in the last one, he and a part of his expedition were lost in the Hudson Bay. In fact, they got becalmed and caught in the ice in this same ship, in the Half Moon. And when the ice began to clear, Hudson said, "We're going further. We'll make it." And the crew said no, and they mutinied. And they left Hudson and his son and a few people who were faithful to Hudson in the ship, and he was never found again. So he disappeared at the age of 45 in what today is called Hudson Bay. Rondout, though, and ultimately Kingston, as I'm sure all you historians know, was not settled for almost 40 years after that time. There was a fort built here, a redoubt, as it was called. Rondout probably gets its name from that, to trade with the Indians, but it was not something that was particularly long-lived. And it wasn't until 1652, a little bit more than 40 years later, that a man named Thomas Chambers, and you'll see on his stone here, there it is, you see, this was his gravestone. It is now, I understand, upstairs in storage somewhere. Ted Dietz was telling me that early on. But Chambers was really the driving force that brought people to Kingston, among them a chap named Kit Davis, who was kind of an Indian scout, and they said he sold alcohol to the Indians, and he frolicked with them. I like that word, frolicking, that sort of thing. But Chambers was an interesting chap. He was a carpenter, so he was called a clapboard. He had red hair, and they said he had sort of a fiery temperament. But in the early days, he was probably the most prominent, most important, most powerful person in Kingston. And he ultimately built a large manor and an estate out a little bit to the north of where the armory is, out that way, out towards, towards Saugerties and that sort of thing. And he called it Foxhall. And of course, the road from downtown was Foxhall Road and went to that area. Chambers was prominent. He was a factor in the war with the Indians. He lived, as you can see, until 1694, quite a long time, till the end of that era. And Chambers' life pretty much shapes those early days of Kingston and Rondout. And when he was buried, although he lived up above, as you know, out off Albany Avenue, today's Albany Avenue, he wanted to be buried in Rondout, and he was. But in the 1850s, Rondout experienced a great building boom, and his bones were disinterred and buried in the new Montrepose Cemetery, and ultimately his stone was in another building, and finally it was brought here, and that's where it is. He had hoped to have his children inherit his property, but they were not his own children. He was unable to have children, and he had one condition in the will, and that was he would give them all the property if they would take his name. They said they would, but then, of course, they changed their mind, and so the property was divided, and you know what things of that sort are like, that kind of thing. But Thomas Chambers remains in Montrepose Cemetery, and he's really the founder of Kingston. Where he came was not unknown. Chambers had been a tenant in the early 1640s up in the area of Troy in Rensselaerswyck. And that was a platoon ship that was owned by a chap named Uter von Twiller. You probably know his name from Washington Irving, wrote about him in his Knickerbocker Tales and things of that sort. And von Twiller was really a twiller. He really was that. He was incompetent. And so Chambers, when his tenantship was up, where he came was not unknown. Chambers had been a tenant in the early 1640s up in the area of Troy in Rensselaerswyck. And that was a platoon ship that was owned by a chap named Uter von Twiller. You probably know his name from Washington Irving, wrote about him in his Knickerbocker Tales and things of that sort. And von Twiller was really a twiller. He really was that. He was incompetent. And so Chambers, when his tenantship was up, he said to himself, I'm going to find a place where there are no patroons. So he came back down the river, which was less settled, to Great Esopus, right, Rondout area, and that's where he settled. At this time in 1777, you're familiar with this, of course, the burning of Kingston, right? We just had a reenactment of that, have that almost every year, that sort of thing. The British decided that if they were going to take New York State, a very important state, they would take it by dividing and conquering. So they were going to send St. Leger from the west down the Mohawk to Albany, and they were going to send Burgoyne from Canada, from Montreal to Albany, and they were going to send Howe up the river from New York to Albany, and they would take Albany, and that would, they would have New York State. But of course, thank God, it didn't work out. As you know, Leger was stopped in Oriskany, and Burgoyne was stopped in Saratoga, and Howe never got his act together and went in the wrong direction. So we were lucky, but Kingston was not, because when they heard that Burgoyne was having difficulty in Saratoga, Clinton, who was the head of the forces in New York at that time, he dispatched, right, Wallace and Vaughan, right? Wallace was the admiral and Vaughan was the general, up the river with a flotilla of some 20, 30 ships or so, and over 1,000 men and so on. And they were going to go help Burgoyne, but on the way up, they decided to, wreak a little havoc. And you probably know that they took the forts in the highlands, and then they cut the chain, that famous chain that was across the river near where West Point is today, Stony Point, and so on. And then they came up the river and they saw Kingston. But it wasn't like, the days of Henry Hudson where they said, oh, there's some interesting Indians there, let's see, what they have to sell or anything like that. There was Kingston there, and they came in, and Kingston was undefended. George Clinton had not been able to make it back in time. There were only a couple of guns up on the hill at Pankaki above the river, one little teeny boat called the Lady Washington, and so on. And of course, the English came ashore in Columbus Point, which is out where Kingston Point would be. We'll talk about that later on. And the Strand, and they burned everything in their way. And within about 3 hours, Kingston was a smoking ruin. So well into the 19th century, 1800s, early 19th century, Rondout, here's a shot of it, right? It's somewhat exaggerated, as paintings tend to be those times. This is probably one of the earliest images of Rondout in the early steamboat era, right? So you notice there's steamboats there, so it's going to be after 1807, right, when Thomas Jefferson was president, because in 1807, Jefferson was involved too. You remember the Claremont goes up the Hudson River. Takes about 32 hours to go from New York to Albany, but that was a hell of a lot faster than the sloops that took 2 weeks, right? That sort of thing. But this is very early days. In the very early days, it took Kingston and Rondout a long time to restore a normal life. The burning of Kingston, the depredations which experienced, the state as a whole experienced, were profound. I don't think, it's interesting, when you read American history, they always tell you about Yorktown, they tell you about George Washington, they tell you about Virginia, tell you about Boston, whatever else, the shot heard around the world. But in point of fact, New York State suffered more than any other state. And it was a long time before recovery, really. Kingston, of course, was a smoking ruin. As you know, supposedly there was only the one house, the Van Steenberg house. Well, everything that they were going to eat for that winter was burned. Vanderlyn was born, in a house that became just like a little lean-to on the side of another building in Kingston, right over here, off Wall Street. So in the early 1820s, Rondout was still a pretty slow place. There were only a couple, as far as we know from these early images, a couple of buildings made out of stone. There were no public buildings, no schools, no churches, nothing of that sort. It was basically a landing where sloops would go to New York City once a week. It would take them 2 weeks, a week down and a week back, and they would, bring the agricultural products primarily to the area. It still was primarily a landing and a shipping area for agricultural products. The next individual of significance in Rondout, we've talked about Henry Hudson and his crew and the Indians. Thomas Chambers, for example, the so-called first settlers, really Chambers' idea, and he bought the property and he brought the people here. And really the third significant individual, other than that rat, Vaughan, who burned Kingston and sort of set us back for 75 years or so, was a man named Maurice Wirz. I kind of like this image. He was a Swiss-American. He was an entrepreneur, a merchant of some significance from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Really, it's interesting that Philadelphia would have such an influence on this area and really provide the initial capital and the idea to really change this area entirely from what was primarily an agricultural area into an extreme, commercial area, I guess would be the word that you would use. Wirz was an interesting chap. He was always looking for a good deal, And he was affluent enough, as you could see, and he went on a hunting trip just a few years into the so-called War of 1812. This was about 1814 or so. We were still at war with England. Coal, which we had gotten primarily from England, was no longer obtainable, so that, that was an issue, a problem, as we would say. And on this hunting trip in the upper Lackawanna Valley, which is in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania, the coal mining area, he came across fairly extensive deposits of hard coal. Hard coal was not really used in the United States, but he figured, well, if we had that, it's better than nothing, and maybe they will use it. And of course, ultimately, they used primarily hard coal because it didn't pollute as much. So anyway, he bought all these outcroppings, and he decided that what he was going to do was bring this coal to Philadelphia and make a fortune. And he did try a number of things. One of them was trying to raft them out of the mountains and so on, but it was very complex, very difficult, very dangerous, and very expensive, and it didn't really work out. So he talked to a man named Cutterbank. You know Cutterbankville, down below Ellenville, down that way and so on. And Cutterbank said, well, if you want to get it to a major city, why not New York? And one way I suggest that you do that is to follow the old mine road, use the Hudson River Valley and the Hudson Creek, build locks and whatever, and come out at Eddyville in Kingston. He said, I think that'll work. And so he had an individual named Wright, who was the main engineer who built the Erie Canal, which was being built at the same time. This was a time of canals that were privately financed. So he said, geez, I think that's good. And Wright said, yeah, I think it'll work. So this chap, who was quite a salesman too, he put together a nice brochure, right? Something like, you could do, Mr. Tantillo. And he had a map of it, and he said it's only going to be about 100 miles, a little bit more of that long. And he brought a whole load of coal from Pennsylvania, and he made a great big roaring fire, like this, in the Tontine Coffee House, right? This coffee house in downtown New York at that time, and he invited everybody in, and by 1 o'clock he had sold all the shares to the company, right? And the company was, of course, a great success. They brought all sorts of immigrants in, German particularly, Irish and so on. They built the canal in 3 years. It was about, maybe 4 feet deep and about 30 feet wide, and it made a fortune. It made a fortune. So it revolutionized Rondout, really. It was coal that did it, right? Coal from Honesdale, Pennsylvania, taken in barges, as you can see down here, right? And pulled and dragged and whatever, 100 some odd miles to Eddyville and into the Rondout Creek, and that's really what built Rondout and changed the whole shape of what this area was about. Well, the D&H Canal, right? From the Delaware, right, which is down near Honesdale to Kingston to the Hudson River. The D&H Canal was built in about 3 years, from about maybe 1824 to about 1825, 28. I think opened about 1828. So, and it ran for 70 years. Right? Talk about that. Rondout then became the depository for all of this coal. Right? So all these tugs are going to take it down the river, and other things too. They found cement. You'll see that in a few minutes. We'll talk about that sort of thing. And these barges, of course, what were used. This is right where a company, what is it called? This is the Strand, and this was the building that was the focus of the activities of the D&H Canal. And everything that happened in Rondout was, to a great extent, at least in the early years, was shaped by what the canal wanted and what they didn't want. And most of it was like IBM in the early years here. Everybody worked for them, and that sort of thing. But that's the Rondout Creek. But the next chap, who I know must be a relative of our of our good friend, right, Paul O'Neill, is Thomas Cornell. Right? Cornell's an interesting. I think this is a Vanderlyn painting too. I'm not positive, but I think Vanderlyn maybe did this one. Cornell was a interesting and a dominating person. He was born in 1802, right? Thomas Jefferson was president there. He came to Rondout in 1837 when he was 35 years old. He was born down the river near Tarrytown and so on. He very quickly established himself in Rondout. He started in 1837 as he came to Rondout, and his uncle was here before him. and he went into business with his uncle in Eddyville and Salem with like a ship chandlery shop, right, to sell things to canalers. But very quickly, he began to represent steamboat companies, and then to own his own steamboats, and then to own his own canal boats, and then to build the banks in Rondout, and then to build the railroads and so on. He was an entrepreneur beyond belief, right? He came to Rondout in 1837, which is the year that this chap, right, I think you probably know who this is, who this chap became the 8th president of the United States. That was the Red Fox, right? You call him the Red Fox, but he doesn't look too red. Yeah, it was a little red, I guess. That was Martin Van Buren, right, who slept in the house, right, remember Ed knows, right, over that Fred Johnson home when he was a state senator, I think he represented the state. But he became the 8th president of the United States, and he was the first president to come from New York State, which is interesting. It showed how New York had developed from those early days after the Revolution, where everything was gone and burned and times were so tough, to a position by the 1830s when New York State became really the empire state, right? The state with the biggest population by that time, the most money, things of that sort. This is Eddyville, right? This is where, depending on your direction, where the D&H Canal began or it ended. I guess technically it began here because this is lock number 1. You'll see it going right into the lock. And that was the first lock. And by locks, they would bring the boat in, and that would raise it up to the next level and so on. And there were over 100 locks between Kingston, or Eddyville, really. Right? That's where it entered the Rondout Creek. And you'll notice some of the canal boats coming down and so on. And that's where Thomas Cornell began. Right? He began as just a shopkeeper, right? Things of that sort. But of course, very quickly, well, when they were digging the canal and the locks and so on, you've probably been through Rosendale and seen, you can still see some of that, and High Falls particularly, when they would go over streams and whatever else. They found cement, and so Cornell got in on that too, right? He invested in that also, and so his boats started to bring cement out also, as well as coal and various other sorts of things. Cornell represented steamboat captains for a while, and then he got his own ships, and he, even more, I think, more soundly, economically, he got into tugs. And that was really the beginning of the Cornell Steamboat Company, which was the longest running company, consistently running company in Rondout. It lasted until the 1950s, really. And the ships were still used by New York Trap and Rock until 1965. But his tugs, here are some of them in the winter, right along Island Dock in the back there, and they were known for their red and yellow colors. And Cornell probably thought there would never be a day when there wouldn't be red and yellow tugs on the Hudson River. But of course, after 1965, that ended. This was thought to be the oldest steamboat on the river, the Norwich. It wasn't built by Cornell, but Cornell purchased it. But what's even more interesting here is not just, it was an old sidewheeler, is the building, which I'm sure you're still familiar with. It's still there. We'll talk a little bit, if you're still with me, by the end of the talk, we'll talk a little bit about urban renewal and how so many of the great buildings, Cornell's office, for example, disappeared in urban renewal. But there are a number of them that are still in existence, and the old Cornell shops where the boats were fixed and so on was there. And it's been many things, apartments and...
I think it's currently owned by Robert Steuding.
That could be. It's a restaurant now, isn't it? Something
No, that's a steel house.
Cornell did many things. I think there's some other slides there that we probably missed, but we'll pass on them. He developed the banks, Rondout Savings Bank, the First National Bank of Rondout. He built 4 railroads, particularly the Ulster and Delaware and so on. And one of the interesting things that he did in the latter part of his life, he died in 1890, but this was built about 1891. Okay, thank you. He built the Grand Hotel up where the ski slopes are on Rose Mountain across from High Mount. You know, Bel Air, that sort of thing. If you go up and then you look back across, this is where the Grand Hotel was. It was one of the largest hotels in the United States at that time. A lot of famous people stayed there. Jay Gould is one of them. But Cornell owned it. He built it. And so his railroads would bring people up to stay in the summer, and they would stay at his hotel up there. It's gone now. In 1964, it was demolished, and its contents sold. By then, of course, it was not owned by the Cornells anymore. Anyway, the Grand Hotel is a part of it. Cornell had a number of competitors, interesting people. One was a man named Jacob Tremper. The Trempers are still prominent in Kingston in insurance, real estate, and so on. This man was the second of a series of Trempers. He was a captain on the river, and he and his father before him competed with Thomas Cornell for the traffic, for the passengers who would go on the great liners down to New York City and back and so on, and for the freight that would be shipped. This is a wonderful shot of Rondout. Great shot. Here it has everything in it. Right? It has a steamboat. Right? It has the Cornell tug that would have been red and white. Right? It has downtown. Here's the Strand. These with all these churches. This is Wirt Street. Right? Wirt Street is still the street of churches in Rondout. All of them are not used, but many of them are. There are probably 5, 6, 7 churches down there. You can see that, and here's where Broadway would be coming down the hill. This is St. Mary's, right? That sort of thing. Of course, all these buildings are gone because they were taken, and it is interesting in terms of urban renewal that when Rondout was demolished, the side that was locals was demolished, right? The east side, but the west side was preserved. And that was the one that was originally developed by the canal. Remember, those are the canal ones. So there may have been, something interesting about that. Anyway, another chap. Just going to do it this way. Oh yeah, I didn't show you that. Talking about Tremper and the Grand Hotel. Tremper also built his own hotel. It was called Tremper House. Right? It was in Phoenicia. This is where Phoenicia developed. It's still there, but of much diminished size. But if you go up on that little rise right behind the town of Phoenicia, right, up in the Catskill Mountains of Shandaken, you'll see what's left of that. That was his hotel. They all built his hotel. The other competitor was a man named Absalom Anderson. Absalom Anderson. And he was from Port Ewing. Absalom Anderson was the man, and we thank him for it, who built the Mary Powell. And of all the great ships on the river, the Mary Powell was the most famous and the most beloved. It was said that when she came into Kingston, in Rondout, which was her port, when she came into Rondout at the end of the day, and you have to realize that the Mary Powell was commissioned in 1861, the beginning of the Civil War. Commissioned, second year was extended. They made it another 20 some odd feet longer. But that ship sailed every day, 6 days a week, except Sunday, to New York City and back for over 50 years. Over 50 years. And it was said that when it came in the port at night, it would leave, right? It would leave Kingston at 6 o'clock in the morning. So you think if you're a commuter now, it would leave the port at 6 o'clock in the morning, right on the nose. They could hear when it blew the whistle, it was going out, right? At 6 o'clock, and it would be in New York. It took 5 hours to get to New York. Now it takes 3 hours to drive to New York now, right? Almost, if you get in traffic. 5 hours down, had a 4-hour layover, and it would be back in 5 hours at 8 o'clock at night, every night. And he said people set, I know we hear this in terms of railroads, people would set their clocks, right, by the Mary Powell when she came in and out. People thought of her as a person. And when she was decommissioned in 1919 and stripped, and pushed over against the bulkhead in Slatesburg, you know, to rot, which she did throughout the 20s and throughout the 30s. Right? My father remembers seeing them and so on, that sort of thing. I mean, when people saw it in Rondout, they almost cried. You know, it was like...
Any sleeping accommodations?
It was not a night boat. It was not a night boat.
Didn't he leave his wife on the dock because she didn't get there on time?
If Ed says it, it's true. If Ed says it, it's true. And wonderful stories like that, you know, wonderful stories. People that rode on the Mary Powell, and you can see what a beautiful ship she was. She was a side-wheeler. She was very fast, but a safe trip, you know. I mean, she wasn't a dangerous ship and so on. And many, many famous people rode on her and wrote about her. Ulysses S. Grant, right, the great general and president of the United States, and J.P. Morgan, and Oscar Wilde, the dramatist, and even Walt Whitman, right, the great American poet who came to Kingston 3 times to visit John Burroughs. And here's a picture of old Johnny, who lived in West Park. There he is, playing with his grapes, right? He would grow grapes down there in West Park, and then he'd put them on the boat, and the boat would take him to New York, and he'd sell them and so on. But Whitman, probably the greatest poet of the 19th century, the good gray poet, wrote about the Civil War and so on, so touchingly and so on. He and Burroughs were very good friends, and he came up the river 3 times, in 1877, 78, 79. In 78, he wrote for the New York Tribune about it, and he said that it was an experience without precedent, without precedent. He said the ship was trim and fast and made few stops, right? That sort of thing. Anyway, that's a little bit about the Mary Powell, but we could talk about her all night. There's Johnny, too. Thought I would show you this. Burroughs, of course, did not live in Rondout, but that was his port. He would leave there by boat, and that's how he wrote the city, as everyone did, that sort of thing. Burroughs was a great raconteur, storyteller, lover of nature, and these are co-eds students from Vassar. He was particularly in love with Vassar, as was Kirkendall, right? That sort of thing. I want to talk a little bit about the woman whose photograph I'll show you in a minute. Her name was Julia McEntee Dillon. She and her husband ran the Langworthy Dillon Steam Engine Company. It was a foundry. They made boilers for the great ships. They refitted the Mary Powell, in fact, twice with boilers. They fabricated some of those wonderful, if you've gone down what's left of Broadway and you look on the west side, of those wonderful iron fronts of those buildings. It'll say made in Rondout. That was made by their company. She was a world-class painter, right? Undoubtedly, the Senate House owns some of hers, and of course there are many of her paintings out in Stone Ridge in Marbletown at the Bevere House. Some were stolen, as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago. She painted still lives, primarily of flowers and frequently of peonies. She loved peonies, and her painting of peonies won an international prize at the Columbian exhibition in Chicago in the latter part of the 19th century. She studied in Europe. She taught. She was an excellent world-class painter. But when her husband died in 1873, she took over the ironworks, and she ran it successfully for about 20 years or so. So it's kind of interesting. She is an example of the many women whose names, you know, many of them are in my book, but we think more of males in terms of Rondout, you know, in an era when males seem to take precedence. But Rondout was filled with many, many professional women who were doctors, nurses, dentists, and so on, ran shops, and she's a good example of that. She was also very public-spirited. In later years, she moved up to Pearl Street, 109 Pearl Street. You know, when you go down that dip there, and she was back in there. And she would teach classes, paint. She had no problem selling her work. She was self-supporting as an artist and listed as an artist in the Kingston Directory. She was also a great gardener. She wrote a wonderful pamphlet, which you still sometimes find around. It was reprinted for years and years, called The Old Gardens. of Kingston. It's a real classic. If you're a gardener, you want to get a copy of that. She wrote that too. She was prominent in civic events. She was one of the major founders of the Kingston Hospital, of the Kingston Library, on and on and on. Very, very interesting and important person. She was born in Rondout. She was a McEntee. If you know the McEntee Street that goes along right above where St. Mary's is, and the base of the hill and that sort of thing. The McEntees were engineers. They were involved in the building and the maintenance of the D&H Canal, and she was affluent. She was the eldest of 10 children. She was born on West Chestnut Street, right? So you know that sort of thing. I'll show you these in somewhat quick succession. These are going to be shots, the next three, of how crowded Rondout was. I want to talk a little bit about that, right? We're headed towards the end if you're getting itchy. This shot was taken in 1896 by Lionel Delisier. There was a street there, but it's gone when urban renewal was. It's just before you make the hard turn, before you go down to the light by St. Mary's, right? This is like below West Chestnut Street, that kind of thing. You're looking down into the river. Just three quick shots. This one's a glorious one. This was done in the 1880s with a glass plate. So it's clear. Look at how dense. Rondout is a little bit over 200 acres, but only about 200 acres of that is buildable. In the 1840s, Rondout had a population of about 1,500. In the 1850s, right? In the 1850s, 10 years later, Rondout's population had quadrupled. It was 6,000. So you can imagine 6,000 people living in a little bit less than 200 acres, right? And what would occur? And of course, what occurred was incredible crowding and pollution, right? We'll talk about it in a minute, about the brick factories and the bluestone and the cement mills and all of that. It was a dangerous place to live. You never knew if something was going to explode or there was going to be, rock would come down on people and so on from the mining that was going on, the cement mines and things of that sort. And there were gangs in Rondout, as a matter of fact. There were gangs in Rondout, which is interesting. The one I found most interesting was a gang called the Bumblebee Boys. The Bumblebee Boys. Now that sounds pretty tame, but they were one of a number of what would I think today we would call Americanist groups. They wanted the foreigners out. And of course Rondout was filled with immigrants. With Germans and Italians later, and Poles and Irish, and on and on and on. So, great shot of that, that sort of sense. And one of the things that occurred, in addition to the crowding and the stench and the sounds, it was a very noisy place. That's why West Chestnut Street developed, because the people who had money could get up there to get, out of that. There really wasn't much air circulation, and, that whole sort of thing. So by the 1830s, and particularly 1840s, plagues began to sweep through Rondout, right? I mean, real plagues. We're talking about yellow fever, cholera particularly. There were 4 cholera epidemics where hundreds of people died in Rondout. And you figure you're only talking about a couple thousand anyway. That's a high percentage of individuals. Everybody who could leave Rondout, and that, of course, was people who had money, right? People who could leave Rondout, they fled Rondout. They closed the canal, business, stopped, things of that sort. And one of the interesting things was at this time, particularly in the biggest plague of all in 1849, but these plagues were sweeping through New York City and Philadelphia and any cities that had immigrants that would come into, would come in and be sick, and they'd sort of sneak in and that sort of thing. There were no hospital. There was no hospital in Rondout. They were absolutely unprepared. Even year after year, epidemic after epidemic. Very few doctors, right? No medical procedures or policies or anything of that sort. So that conditions were poor. But this chap I came across, and his name was John Wales, Dr. John Wales. And he came to the United States in 1842 from Ireland. He was an Irishman, which Rondout was filled with Irishmen, as you know, particularly Irish and German in the early days. And although Wales looks a little grumpy here, he only lived into his 50s, but Wales almost single-handedly turned around the cholera epidemic in 1849. but an interesting part of the story.
How did he do that? How did he turn the epidemic around?
He did it by getting other doctors to come. He did it by instituting sanitary procedures. I mean, at this time in Rondout, there was no garbage pickup. Garbage was thrown in the streets, and pigs were allowed to root through the garbage. It was a way they disposed of the garbage. The pigs also got into the cemeteries, which were on the sides of the hills. This is before Montrepose was built, things of that sort, and they would dig up the bodies, right, and eat the bodies. That was very common. The streets were not paved. There were no sidewalks. There was no potable source of water. There was standing polluted water. I mean, it's hard to even imagine what it was like. So he was involved in that. And lots of breweries in Rondout. The major industries in Rondout, while they contributed to the financial well-being of people, supported them, and everyone pretty much worked in one of them or the other, also added to the high level of not only noise, but pollution in Rondout, right? It was a very, very dusty place, as you can imagine. The brickyards, for example, which were out by Kingston Point, owned by Courts and Hutton, so on. But there were many other ones did that. Immigrants primarily worked there. They were paid about 80 some odd cents a day. They were expected to build or make or bake about 1,000 bricks a day, so on. That was one of the sources of income. Another one, of course, was bluestone. Kingston's known for bluestone. And bluestone would come rumbling out of the great quarries that are still there, of course, up in West Hurley, Stony Hollow, Sawkill, right? That's where, it was said, and I've seen some photographs of it, that there would be a line of big bluestone wagons, some of them taking pieces of bluestone that were 8, 10, 12 feet long, out of there, and they would come down out of those areas and cross the Esopus Creek and then go down Wall Street. And there are actually photographs, Ed's probably seen them, of these giant pieces of stone on wagons like those going down Wall Street. And they would go all the way to the end of Wall Street and then down Wall Street, South Wall, and down to these yards which are in Wilburn. Right? That's the West Shore Bridge there. And off in the distance, we'll talk about it in 1 minute, is the Knickerbocker Ice Company. Right? That's where the ice was kept in Rondout. Most of the workers were Irish who worked in the canal. Who worked in Probably the most famous one was Memphis Brothers. You've probably seen this. This still exists down in Wilburn. This building is still there. It's been renovated. Oh, use the microphone. Right. Sorry. And they would handle about maybe $2,000 worth of stone a day, right, which was astounding, right, in those days. Ice was cut. Maybe go to the next one too. Ice was cut and brought up into these buildings. Most of the people that worked on the ice cutting were either locals who did not live in Rondout, they came from the country down, or they were canalers who were out of work, right? They were out of work half the year when the canal was frozen. So they couldn't wait until the river would freeze so they could cut ice. They made 88 cents a day too, from early morning till early night. And the ice was stored in these large houses and, of course, brought to New York. This was before refrigerators and refrigeration, things of that sort. That one supposedly held about 80,000 tons of ice during the day. Again, interesting, this is one of those wonderful glass plates. This is headed towards Wilbur, right? Headed towards Eddyville. Remember the Norwich that we saw before? And, of course, the railroad bridge that was built in the 1880s. This is great. Cement, we talked about before. The Newark Lime and Cement Company came to Kingston, came to Rondout in the 1840s. They bought the quarries under Hasbrook Park, right, or called the Vleitsburg in the early days. And, of course, they were mined, well into the latter part of the 19th century. Tremendous amount of concrete or limestone came out of those caves. It's said that some of the tunnels go down almost 90 or 100 feet below sea level. I've never been in them. This building is still there. You've probably seen it. If you go to the shops that we looked at before, the Cornell shops, and you look up on the hill, right, this is like behind where the Railroad Museum is and so. This building is still there. I think you still see that. This is great. We should have thought of this before. The chap who developed them, his name was James Lindsley. And you know Lindsley Avenue, right? Again, all the names of the streets in Rondout were named for either early settlers who owned the property or people from the D&H Canal, one way or another, or entrepreneurs. Lindsley Avenue, as you know, goes up the hill from Pankaki above it, up onto the hill, and that big house up there was the house that was owned by Quartz, who was one of the individuals who owned the brick company right down below in Kingston Point. Lindsley was an interesting chap. He was a teetotaler, which was rare in Rondout, as you might imagine. Everyone was interested in the cold one, at the end of the day. He came from New Jersey. He married the daughter, Sarah, of Tompkins, and Tompkins owned the lime and cement, the Newark Lime and Cement Company. And he was the one who was really involved in building and establishing this.
Tompkins runs into the McEntee family as well.
That I didn't know. That's interesting to know. They all married each other, that's for sure, and kept the money in the family. So I'm glad to hear that. Tompkins also, his father-in-law, built one of the houses that were purchased in 1926 by St. Ursula Academy, right? And now, I think that one is still in existence. The Crane House is gone, but that one is part of the children's home now, I think. But that was his father-in-law. Anyway, he became the supervisor of Rondout. He finally was the one who paved the streets and made sidewalks and developed a sewer plan and got potable water and things of that sort. But of course, that was pretty late on. He was the first mayor in 1872 when Kingston and Rondout were joined, and they built the city hall, right, which was right in the middle of these two sort of warring communities. One could suggest that that was the end of Rondout, really, when it joined with Kingston. It lost a lot of its autonomy and other things too. But he was involved in that. In his latter years, he was a congressman, which is interesting, as was Thomas Cornell. Thanks. But finally, home stretch, right? So if you're getting itchy, here we go. To my mind, one of the most, if not the most interesting figures in Rondout was Samuel Decker Kirkendall. Kirkendall was to the latter years, the last years of Rondout, what Cornell was in the first years. He was the one who took charge, who owned everything, who employed most people, who really changed the landscape profoundly. He was not born, though, importantly, in 1836. Right? That's an error, and as Mr. O'Neill knows, he was born in 1837, which is better for us because that's the year that Thomas Cornell came to Rondout. So his successor, because Samuel Decker Kirkendall married Thomas Cornell's only daughter, and he inherited the ranch, as you might say. So as Thomas Cornell became interested in other things, like going to Congress, he was a congressman for 2 terms, his son-in-law, Samuel Decker, took over the show, and he began to run the railroads and the Cornell Steamboat Company and the hotels and things of that sort. He was a very interesting chap. He had been a clerk when he came to Rondout. He just worked as a clerk in a store. He was 22 years old when he came to Rondout, 1859. But then the Civil War, right, in a few years, 1861 developed, and he joined the Civil War. He became a volunteer, became quartermaster in the Civil War in the 156th Volunteer Regiment. In Ulster County, there were really 3 regiments or 3 groups of people that went to the Civil War that were primarily from Ulster County, that sort of thing. There was the 20th, which was a militia, which had existed prior to that, and they went early on. But then there were 2 volunteer groups, 2 volunteer regiments. The first one was the 120th Volunteers, and then the 156th, and he was in that so-called Mountain Regiment, and they fought in different campaigns. He was a quartermaster. He learned how to get stuff and get it to other people, transport it, that sort of thing. So when he came back to Rondout, he was older, he was more experienced, and he had a certain prestige because he was a Civil War veteran. Right? A lot of people from Rondout, I wrote a great deal about that in the book. It's really interesting. A lot of people from Rondout went and fought in the Civil War, never came home. Tremendous amount. The impact was profound. But he was one who survived, and when he came back, he didn't act as a clerk anymore. He got a job with Thomas Cornell and fell in love with his daughter, married his daughter, and they had 7 kids, 6 boys and 1 girl. Right? 6 boys and 1 girl, which is interesting. And later on, when he became old, 2 of the boys took over the businesses. But Decker Kirkendall, he was the one who said, we'll see grass on Wall Street. Anyway, let's finish this up. Kirkendall did many things. I, being someone who lives in the Catskills, grew up in the Catskills, and loves them deeply, I wanted to show you some Catskill slides, and I showed you one already of the Grand Hotel, right, which is up in High Mount. But one of the things that Kirkendall did, which has always interested me, seemed almost out of character. This is Alder Lake, and show the next slide, if you will. This is Alder Lake. He built a wonderful, great lodge, an estate up on Alder Lake. He'd been a member of a kind of a fishing group there, and that didn't work out. And then he bought all the land. I mean, we're talking about thousands of acres in the middle of nowhere. Right? This is in the far end of Hardenburg. Right? It's about as far away from Kingston as you can get. Hardenburg has a total population of less than 300 people. And he bought this estate on Alder Lake. Right? And that was the house. Sadly, that house is gone. I photographed that probably in the 80s or so, but now the state has knocked it down, and I haven't been back. Sort of broke my heart. We tried to save it, but it didn't work. But this was a wonderful house. But now it's like a romantic ruin. But that's on Alder Lake, and that was his estate, and he would take the train up to Arkville, and then they'd take wagons and go over the mountain and cross the mountain and come down into that. But it's still a very, very desolate part. It's up near Turnwood. It's on the Beaver Kill, and so on. Anyway, he built this estate, but that's not what he's remembered for. What he's remembered for is what he did out on Kingston Point. And Kingston Point was called, right up until Kirkendall made the change, it was called Columbus Point, primarily, Columbus Point. And it was associated with a number of interesting things. One, of course, is that's where some of the English came on land in 1777 when they burned. One of the contingents came to Rondout and the other one came to Columbus Point, where Kingston Point is now. It was also thought to be the site of one of the burials of treasure of Captain Kidd, who, like George Washington, has probably buried treasure and slept in houses all over the Western world. But people like to think of that. It was where the ferry that the Livingstons owned from Dutchess County came across too. Right? The ferry came across there. A lot of interesting things happened there. And in 1893, when Samuel Decker Kirkendall, I've done this, I've sort of mixed the two up. When Kirkendall decided he would build an amusement park out there, it was still called Columbus Point, and it was really the terminus, what in the early 19th century had been the Ulster and Delaware Turnpike. Right? That's where the Ulster and Delaware Railroad got its name. Turnpike was never successful, but it went from there all the way up into Delaware County. But it did go bankrupt. And a chap named Moses Cantine, who was of French heritage, about 100 years before Kirkendall's time, he had built a housing development there. That was the first housing development, undoubtedly, in Ulster County. He said, we'll build castles on the point. And he built a big house there himself, a 2-story house. No remains of it at all. But Kirkendall thought, that's fine. Right? Kirkendall thought this would be a great place to not only build an amusement park, but to connect the railroad with the river. Because when the day line came up with all these people that wanted to come to the mountains, right? By the 1890s, everybody was going to the Catskills. Right? They would come up the river on the boats, and then they would take the U&D up into the Catskills. But if you did that, you had to come to Rondout, and the day line stopped at Rhinecliff. Right? It would come in there. It didn't come in at Kingston. There was just a little wharf there for the D&H Canal that owned Kingston Point or Columbus Point at that time. So when he bought the point, right, he refurbished or renovated the wharf and made it so it could take the big day liners. And he ran his railroad out there. He made a spur from downtown Rondout, right? He ran it out to the point. So people, if you show the next one, they could come up on the day line, right, from New York City. There's the Washington Irving coming in. That was one of the biggest boats. They could get out, right, at this wharf, which he's now built, walk across, right, and get on the train. So they didn't have to get out at Rhinebeck, and then they would have to take the ferry across, and then they would have to go to downtown Rondout, right, and that whole sort of thing. They could just come up, dock there at the day line, walk across, get on the train, and the train would take them right up. And guess what hotel they would go to? Grand Hotel. Who owned the hotel, right? Who owned the railroad? Who owned the day? Right? They owned everything, right? It was when monopolies were not considered a bad thing. Right? And if you had a monopoly, you had it lined up. However, if you, didn't plan to take the railroad up to the mountains, for a week or two or a year or a month or whatever, you could just go on this path, right? And notice the Chinese gazebo here. This is where they'd have concerts. Kingston Point was done in Oriental style, what was thought of as Chinese Oriental style. It was very much in fashion in the late 19th and early 20th century. So you could go across there and then into this wonderful park. In the park had everything that your heart would desire at that time. There were places where you could dance. There were bands there. The admission was free. Right? They had shooting galleries and arcades and a number of restaurants, even one up on the bluff called the Oriental Hotel that sold alcohol. Right? You had to go outside the park for that. Right? It had a trolley that would take you into Kingston. It was 5 cents, right? from Washington Avenue to Kingston Point. 5 cents, right? That sort of thing. And people came there from all over. You could dance, you could stroll on these paths, you could rent a boat and just go on the little lake that was there. I mean, it was like a paradise, and people loved it. A carousel, a Ferris wheel. Yeah, you're right, right? And Ferris wheels were very new at that time. Right? And Kirkendall did the whole thing. In 1903, right, when Alton B. Parker, who was from West Park, right, was the only person from Ulster County who actually almost became president. Right? He was a Democrat, surprisingly. He was an attorney. Right? He had studied in Albany, came to Kingston, practiced law here, and he became a judge of significance. In his latter years, he was the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals, right, in Albany, New York State Court. And in 1903, right, which was the high point, really, of activity at Kingston Point, 1903, he was nominated, agreed to run against Teddy Roosevelt. But he ran what was called a front porch campaign. No campaign. If somebody wanted to come to the front porch, if the media wanted to interview him, that sort of thing, they would come and he would talk to them. But that was it. But he lost, as you might imagine. I don't think anybody could have beaten Teddy Roosevelt, but certainly from his front porch, he never could have done that. But it wasn't as bad as people say. The popular vote was about 5 million for Alton B. Parker from West Park, right, down near where John Burroughs lived. Right? Again, Rondout was his port. About 5 million for him and about 7.5 million for Teddy Roosevelt. It's not too bad. But the electoral vote was more than 2-1 for Roosevelt. When he lost, he just simply went back to work as an attorney. He went to New York City and he died in 1926. But his sort of rise to political significance and Kingston as a presidential area and so on was about 1903. And in 1903, it was said that Kingston Point had about 1 million visitors, about 1 million visitors. Now that doesn't seem like much today, but when you think about it in those days, that's about 3,000 people a day in a very little territory. Almost done. By the 1950s, though, and these are the last few shots, by the 1950s, Rondout had really fallen on bad times. As a matter of fact, most historians believe, and I agree, that Rondout really was in serious decline by the 1920s. One could even suggest that Rondout, as sort of the last attempt at civic and entrepreneurial optimism, was really too late. It was over by that time. And when you think about it, the Kingston Point opened in 1897, right? 1897. And in 1898, the Delaware and Hudson Canal closed. So when you think of the canal as creating Rondout and the park being built 1 year before the canal closes, it was already over in many ways. Rondout quickly became obsolete. No one wanted bluestone anymore. Even the cement, which continued to come out of limestone, cement, and so on that came out of Rosendale. For a while, Kirkendall owned it for a while, then they kept part of the canal open to get it out. That wasn't used anymore either. Portland cement was developed. Refrigeration was developed, so they didn't need ice anymore. Even bricks, which were pretty much the last to go, are not used in the same way that they were used 50, 75, or 100 years ago. Everything that really made Rondout ceased to be what people wanted or needed anymore. Technology really, in many ways, made it obsolete. Also, people were not satisfied with Kingston Point Park anymore. It's like us today. If it isn't electronic and we want the newest one and the next thing, and so on. It's interesting. 1921, the Oriental Hotel at Kingston Point burned down. 1926, Downing Vaux, who was the designer of among many things, many wonderful buildings. Bill Rhodes has written about this in his great book in Kingston. He jumped from the upstairs room of the YMCA and died on Broadway, on the street on Broadway. So he died. 1913, Samuel Decker Kirkendall died. So you think about all these things happening, right? 1929, the Depression comes. 1932, the Ulster and Delaware Railroad goes bankrupt. Bankrupt. Can you imagine that? Ran by sons of Kirkendall, and so on. On and on and on. 1948, the last dayliner stops at Kingston Point, the last regular dayliner. So it's over. So by the 1950s, Rondout was, we talked about this at length, Paul and I, Rondout was derelict. It was forgotten. It was really downtown. It was where poor people lived. It was where trouble was, on and on. And these shots were taken about that time. I would say maybe late 50s or so. You notice the automobiles are like 57s or something like that. And you notice that the Strand is almost empty. The Freeman building is still in operation, right? Thank God for the paper, and so on. But the rest of Rondout, as you'll see in the next shot, right, is desolate. Right? And this street here, where the weeds are growing up, this is Broadway, of course, and this is Ferry Street. This is where Kirkendall and Thomas Cornell's offices were, right? The ferry is discontinued. A bridge is built across the Hudson, right, up where the malls are and so on. And Rondout becomes isolated. Interesting. So by the early 60s, Kingston didn't really know what to do with Rondout. And so in 1961, they hired a company, really in 1960, but the report came out in 1961. They hired a company named Raymond and May. They were professional planners. And they did a plan of what could be done with Kingston as a whole, and specifically Rondout. And in that plan, among many, many things, it's a big, thick fellow, it's like a phone book. But when you read the plan, and you read it, and you see what they said about Rondout, I was primarily concerned with Rondout, what was said about Rondout. They read about Rondout, they said 16% of Rondout was vacant, right? They said that the population of Rondout since 1872, when the two, Rondout and Kingston, were been joined, you remember, and Lindsley was made the mayor, was less than half of what it had been at that time. So the population was going back the other way, right? People were moving out, businesses were moving uptown or to midtown Kingston. Like, for example, Stock and Quartz, which had the largest building in Rondout. I can't remember how many stories, it was by 5, 6 stories, something like that. It was like a skyscraper, in a sense. It was like the only skyscraper in Kingston. They moved to Midtown Kingston. That's Scholars now. They built a similar building in Midtown Kingston. Churches moved out. Synagogues moved out. Temples moved out. It was, it was what it had been. It wasn't like this. This photograph was taken again by Lionel Delisier, and it shows, I wanted to show you that divide. It shows you Broadway, right? It shows you the east side, right, which was associated with locals, and the west side, which was associated traditionally with canals, and of course, here the Freeman building, which had been like a Sampson's Emporium, sold, sort of like a mall. And here's the mansion house. It was built by George von Beck, a German who came. You see one shot. But what they decided is they took that side and they kept this side. But the mansion house and some properties were mercifully saved, right? But they were all on that west sort of side. But they found out that the population had dropped, right? That a large percentage was vacant. They found that the average income in Rondout in those years, 1961, when the report came out, was $1,250 a year. That was the average income in Rondout. And at that time, that was less than half of what it was 10 years earlier in Uptown. So in a sense, the average income in Rondout was probably about a third of what it was in Uptown Kingston, which was profound. So when they wrote up their recommendations, you know, what should we do? What should we do? The number one recommendation was demolition. Demolition. And that's what happened. And that's what happened. Some buildings were saved. The Mansion House is still there, right? Which is wonderful. That's one of the oldest hotels in Kingston. And one of my favorites, the Tubby Row House, was saved. But again, it was saved because it was to the west of Broadway, right? You must know that Broadway was not always called Broadway, right? In the early days, it was called Union Avenue from the 1860s on because of the Civil War, right? Rondout was a staunch supporter. And when Lincoln was shot, and they took his body up the Hudson River on the other side in April, I think, of 1865, all Rondout stood up on the hill. It makes me cry when I think about it. They all stood up on the hill, up where Hasbrook Park is now, right? Where the lime and cement company had been up before. And they just crawled. And they saw that train crawl up the other side of the river. It's one of, I thought, I'm going to use that in the book. And I did put it in the book, but I should have built a whole book around it, right? What a moving thing. I mean, Rondout was very, and when you think about it, that 3 and particularly 2 major volunteer regiments, a substantial portion of them came from Rondout, which was only a portion of the population, right? Rondout was probably 10% at its high point. Rondout was probably in the 1870s or so, and even earlier than that, in the Civil War. Rondout was probably about 10%, roughly, give or take, of the population of the entire county. That's a lot, but it's not a lot, you know, in terms of the population of the county at the time, which was probably 100,000, maybe less, who knows. But the amount of soldiers that came out of Rondout was profound. You know, it was profound. You know, that regiment lost maybe 25, 30% of its, and that's just off the top of my head, I'm not sure. But anyway, some of these buildings to the left were saved, right? Which is wonderful. The Tubby Row House was one of them. It was built by a man and his father named Joseph Tubby. He was an Englishman who came to this country. He was a sign painter and a house painter. He had very little education. He was self-taught. The Senate House has some of his paintings here, and they are glorious. Usually like round, you know, like little round oval ones of Rondout and so on. He invested in this, and he lost his shirt and never really recovered. It had parquet floors. It had a glorious view of the river, of the creek particularly, and it had white marble mantles, right? Something really new. Well, so Rondout, much of it that we know was gone, right? After urban renewal, probably 50, 75% of Rondout was gone. The old days were gone. All the industries were gone, and so on. There was a time in Rondout when you could actually walk across, here you can't, but almost walk across the Rondout Creek on the tops of canal boats that were docked there. There was a time when you could look up, we're looking up from the new bridge, right, at Island Dock, right, towards Rondout, towards the Hudson River, right, sort of looking towards the east, north, that sort of thing. When the coal was so great, so extensive on Island Dock that it was as high as the buildings on the Strand. There was a time in Old Rondout when the great steamships turned around in the creek and the bow and the stern almost touched both sides, right? And there was a time when if you wanted to go to Slatesburg, no bridges then, right? Wirt Street Bridge was built in the 1920s. My father remembers that being built. You would take the old Riverside, or as it was somewhat affectionately called, the Skilly Pot, across from Rondout to Slatesburg. There are wonderful stories of the wagons going off the bridge and things of that sort. But those things were all gone. All gone. And so, really, before anybody was aware of it, Rondout, old Rondout, had sort of slipped its moorings and disappeared into the misty reaches of time. There's a place of fond remembrance. This is a song that was written in 1913 by a man named Barton. It's called Dear Old Rondout. There's a place of fond remembrance, 'tis the spot where I was born. When the flowers of May were blooming, did the forest path adorn. It is some miles from old New York, a place you all do know, and they call it dear old Rondout, where the Hudson River flows. Last stanza. Oh, how well I do remember when I was a little boy. To ramble all the hills and dales was my only joy. Barefoot we played up on the strand, the Hudson's famous shore. My thoughts go back to Rondout, where I long to be once more.
Bob, thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Seward?
More comments and questions.
Okay.
You touched on George von Beck. He was one of the big movers of Rondout. Brickworks, lager beer,
Yes.
military man. Actually a fantastic story on him alone. The Vaux fellow that jumped off the YMCA, his father was Calvin Vaux. He was a brother to Jervis McEntee and the McEntees. He was one of the main architects of Central Park in New York City.
Thank you for sharing.
Abram Crispo was one of the major doctors that warded the yellow fever, along with the other doctors. And he became a surgeon during the Civil War as well, and lived up on West Riley Street.
Wonderful.
The McEntee family was Julie Dillon, her protege was Jervis McEntee, her cousin, and became one of our most famous landscape painters here from the Rondout Kingston area.
Of those wonderful fall paintings.
Magnificent.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I knew that I had to be careful when I was talking about the different regiments and so on, because Seward has always been very generous and helpful to me, and was in this respect on this book, and his knowledge, as Ed's and so many other people here, of the Civil War in particular is staggering. His books are wonderful books on Gates and so on. So thank you.
Any other questions?
Can we assume yellow fever was a result of mosquito infestation?
They first thought in Rondout that it was something that came off citrus fruits on a ship. What that would have been and how it was, I don't know. And I wasn't satisfied that yellow fever was really confirmed in Rondout. You know, they did say that it was and they thought it was, but I think from the symptoms and so on that all four of the major epidemics in 1843, 49, and 34 and 54, it doesn't matter the dates, I think they were all basically cholera. They thought initially it was yellow fever, but I think it was. But I mean, this is really beyond my expertise. Maybe Seward knows.
One of the major factors involved at that time was, we touched upon, was the unsanitary conditions.
Oh,
The fact that they threw garbage in the streets.
Yeah. Standing
in
water.
their
And,
backyard.
yeah.
And it was
Yeah.
very difficult
Yeah.
to traverse around any
Yeah.
of that. And that was a great contributor.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And all of those, there's a wonderful book by and it's still available, by a fellow named Rosenberg. I don't remember his first name. Rosenberg, and it's called The Cholera Years. The Cholera Years. And it's a masterful study of the impact of cholera on urban areas in the United States in the 1830s and 40s particularly, and even into the 1850s. It would last mainly the 3 months of summer when it was hot. I think that cholera was really the dominant. That's the best I can do to answer that.
In the 30s, when the first.
Yeah, 1832, sure.
That actually was from my research.
Yeah.
One of the larger magazine articles I read.
Right.
It came down from Canada and migrated right on down through.
I see.
the
That I
valley,
didn't know.
Greene County and
Yeah.
Greenville was hit hard, and down into
Yeah.
Kingston and Rondout. But
See
it
that?
kinda counted.
Yeah, see, that I didn't know. I didn't know. I mean, primarily these diseases came on ships from other places. But with the sanitary conditions the way they were, it's not surprising. Sure. Is there anything else you want to know that you want to know when you can go, right? You've been really great. Having been a school teacher my whole life when a lot of people were not that interested all the time, it's really an absolute joy to be in an audience where people are here because they want to be.
Rondout, quite frankly, is one of the most magnificent stores
Yeah, it is.
in New York State.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have been in Rondout in the 1850s.
Oh, yeah.
There were so many
Yeah.
magnificent people,
Well,
mansion builders, but
Yeah.
entrepreneurs.
sure.
And military people.
Artists, yeah.
Famous people.
Mark Twain came to Ron, you know, all the famous speakers and poets and so on. We were talking about that, I think, yesterday a little bit. And you can't help but think that, you know, not only is Rondout vital, it's survived urban renewal. You know, when you think about that, a lot of places did not survive urban renewal. Urban renewal was not a bad idea. Money was available. People were not particularly interested in historic preservation the way they are today. And there was a kind of general apathy. But, you know, it survived and it's flourishing. Even half of what Rondout is today is half of what it was in its own day.
Civil War monuments
Yeah.
down there, too.
So it survived, and I think that's not only a miracle, but it's to the credit of people that you know, didn't give up and stayed there and refurbished the houses and established businesses and so on. I mean, I guess that's that vitality. That's why I said at the beginning of the talk, quoting Kirkendall, you know, we may still see grass on Wall Street, and Rondout will rise like a phoenix from the ashes. And so, but I guess that old competition is still there. But it's a wonderful place, and you're right. Yes, it's been considered part of Rondout, although it is a separate community in its own right. It was part of that. I think it's probably still part of the whatever that designation is, and so on. But Pankaki is thought to be an Indian name, and it was an extensive burial ground of Indians. I remember my good friend Mac McCrary. You might remember Mac. Mac died just a while ago. He was a great guy in Kingston, mechanic, really bright guy, engineer. And Mac used to dig out there, and he came across, you know, a tremendous burial ground. And I think so did Burgraff and a number of other people. But that's what it was. But it's been settled primarily by individuals who worked in the cement in the brick industry, primarily Italian. It's a fairly successful Italian community, and it's still a vibrant community. So on, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. So everybody, make sure, based on that, pick up your trash. We don't want cholera back here. Bob, thank you so much. First of all, your book is certainly brought Rondout to life for me. I read it for the first time a number of years ago, and it really gave me an interest in Rondout. And we're talking about Bob's book on Rondout, but Bob has written a number of books, including several on the Catskills, and one on the Ashokan Reservoir. Frank Onquist, some of you I see have made it today. He did a presentation this morning at Fred's of Historic Kingston on the Ashokan Reservoir, and actually gave a shout out to you for your book, and he said he relied on it for his presentation. So Bob has a number of books. They're wonderful. Please check them out. And again, if you've not read that Rondout book, Kingston is a very colorful place. Rondout has given it much of that color. I mean, talk about a Wild West show back in the day. And the Maritime Museum the other night had a slide presentation, and Paul Tully was there, and I was there as well. And it was of a gentleman who he delivered flowers for his father, who was a florist back in the 60s. And the pictures were from 1965 to 1968. of down on the Strand and Rondout. And it's shocking. It's shocking because even when Bob's saying that the report said that it was 16% vacancy, there may have been some, urban renewal was coming, people may have moved, but it looks like about 85%. And the pictures really, they look to me like Berlin right after World War II. It was an unbelievable, for those of you who remember, for those of you who haven't, I remember even 20 years ago, it was a rough place, and there was a lot of vacancies, broken windows. So to see how it's come today is just wonderful. But the history in Rondout has really led so much to Kingston. So, and Bob's book really is one of the main reasons that Rondout, that we really understand what happened down there. So it was well researched. Please pick it up. And Bob, again, when I say he's one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet, I mean he's one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. My first dealing with Bob was I'd actually asked him if he could be the presenter for our Thomas Cornell presentation last winter. And he unfortunately didn't, with time constraints, he couldn't do it. And he was very apologetic. And I said, you're doing me the favor. He pointed me in the right direction of where we should go. But he said, please, any time in the future that I could help out. And as soon as we started talking about Rondout, we knew that Bob was the guy, and he's done a great job. Thank you so much for that. We also want to, again, we always at the end, we really want to thank all the people that make this possible. Again, Jacob and Tom and everybody here at the Senate House. We have it in this wonderful room because they really bend over backwards for us. So please, and they've been having wonderful, wonderful exhibits. There's always something going on here, and they just opened up an exhibit in the Lowren House on the Civil War. I believe it's open Saturdays? Sundays. So you should check it out. It is absolutely wonderful. Bob Rizzo, again, Bob does the videos. He has out there videos from past presentations. If you want a copy of the video for tonight's presentation, he has that. Please get in touch with him. He does a wonderful job. All the people who publicize this event, the reason that the word probably got to you in the first place, Hugh Reynolds, and Hugh always does a big spread on our presentation. So Bob, be prepared. He's going to get in touch with you. Jillian Fisher, Friends of Historic Kingston on their website, Ulster County Tourism, Kingston Community Radio, Kingston Happenings, Daily Freeman Preview, Walt Wilkowski and the Civil War Roundtable. They always post our flyers and do a great job. For those of you especially relevant to this talk, we did a presentation. Ed Ford did the presentation. I'm sure most people were for Samuel Kirkendall at the Kirkendall Cornell Memorial. If you remember, it's gotten a little run down. It was when it was made, it was white, beautiful, bright white. Walt had gone there on evenings and scrubbed. He scrubbed Samuel Kirkendall's tombstone and Thomas Cornell's tombstone and got them back to the bright white. If you haven't been there, he's actually done the rest of the family. It's absolutely beautiful. So we want to thank Walt. He couldn't be here. His mother passed away, so we wanted to give him our condolences. He's a wonderful person. The Kingston's Buried Treasures, Joe Tantillo. Again, Joe, all the flyers, everything we do, he's the brains behind it, so he does a wonderful job. Ed, again, what can you say about Ed? Ed he's the dean, the president. He runs the show. So Ed, thank you for everything you do. Ann Gordon, our Ulster County historian. She was very important and very monumental in the recent unveiling of the Sojourner Truth statue in Port Ewan. It was a wonderful ceremony, and if you haven't gotten there, please get there. It's where the old town hall was, where I had my first jury trial. The courthouse is gone. I went in. I had just become an attorney. Weeks before, I had a jury trial. I didn't know what I was doing. It was Judge Aragema. I said, this is my first jury trial. And he said, me too. And he'd been judged for 32 years, so I didn't feel so bad. Pat Murphy. Pat is, I think, upstairs watching. Pat is wonderful, does so much. Tom Haffey is here. Tom is the majority leader of the Common Council. He does an unbelievable job for this. And Nina Poschupak, our county clerk, please, there's a lot that goes into it. Please thank them for what they do. And JK Wine and Liquor, our official sponsor now. They actually donate the wine, so If you're looking for something, please stop by and help them. Facebook, yeah, on Facebook, Joe has set up a site for us, and there's also sites, one I Love Saugerties, it's I Love Kingston as well, that has wonderful pictures, so please get on there on Facebook. And most importantly, all of you. Again, it's been so wonderful and so heartwarming to see everybody here and the interest everybody has and that we all share in our history. It's a wonderful place we live. When we started this, we were thinking maybe 10, maybe 15 people. So it's been great. We thank you. And again, we'll keep doing it as long as we have subjects, which, you know, we're very fortunate that the list of subjects in our community is really limitless, and people are interested. I want to let people know about our next couple events. November 15th, Arthur Fleming is going to be, our feature speaker is going to be our Assemblyman, Kevin Cahill. He is going to do Arthur Fleming, who was a Kingstonian who had a monumental impact in Washington, D.C., so you're going to learn a lot about him. I didn't know much about him until Tom Haffey told me, but that is going to be very interesting. December, and if you got the flyer, it says December 14th. It's actually December 13th. We made a typo. I apologize. December 14th is a Friday, or a Saturday. It's going to be December 13th. Kingston's bluestone industry. Kingston is, you know, it was like the Rondout and all, we became a boom town. One of the main reasons was bluestone. So Peter Roberts I would say he's the foremost bluestone expert around. He is going to do a presentation on that. So thank you very much, Bob. Thank you so much, and everybody have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you next month.